Okay, it is just after 7 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get rolling. Welcome everyone to tonight's presentation. And tonight we're going to be going over FEGLI, exposed or undercovered. So I do see a lot of familiar faces on the webinar tonight. So for those of you who have been on our webinars before, welcome back. And for those of you who are new, because we're seeing a lot more new folks come to the platform and to our webinars, welcome. A little bit of background about myself and our company. My name is John Mantilla. I'm one of the co-founders and CEO here at Parco. And Parco stands for Pension America's Retirement Company. We do retirement and financial planning for anybody with a pension, but we really focus on federal workers, no matter what stage of their career that they're in. We work with a lot of folks just starting out their careers. We want to make sure that they're making the most out of their new job with the federal government. Folks mid-career who maybe have benefits that they've gotten when they first signed up for the government, who want to make sure that they're in the right spot. And then increasingly folks nearing the end of their careers who want to make sure that as they enter into retirement, that they're positioned properly. Tonight's presentation is particularly relevant for folks across the spectrum because we're talking about life insurance. And so we present to a lot of folks. I know many of you have seen our webinars before, but we present to and work with federal employees across the country and around the world, helping them plan their retirements. So tonight we're going to go through FEGLI and life insurance. We're going to start by focusing on what does it mean to plan your legacy, some of the important things to consider there. We'll talk about what life insurance is. We'll go through FEGLI basics. We'll go through other legacy planning benefits that you have as federal employees. We say this all the time at Parco that federal employees are different because of the benefits that you have, and we'll highlight many of those tonight. Then we'll go through bridging the gap. We'll talk about the long-term FEGLI planning, so especially as it approaches retirement, and then we'll conclude with some action items. Sound good? Cool. So let's first talk about planning a legacy. People ask us all the time, hey, like, what happens to my family if I pass away? Like, what's going to be available to them? Well, what goes to your heirs? Sometimes people start with life insurance. But we always say here at Parco, look, life insurance should just be part of that story. If you pass away, all of your assets and all of your legacy planning benefits will pass on to your estate and your beneficiaries when you die. This includes your real estate, your TSP, your IRAs, any your savings that you have, collectibles that you might have, any other assets, and then, of course, life insurance on top of that. So when people are talking to us about setting up a legacy goal, it always depends on what you want to have happen. We have lots of folks that we work with that say, hey, look, I just want to make sure that my is covered, that my final expenses are covered. Maybe I don't need to leave behind any maintenance. Okay, that's sort of like the far one end of the spectrum. That's the lowest end of the spectrum. Then we have other folks that we work with that they're really intent on leaving as much as possible behind to their beneficiaries and basically having as little for themselves as possible as they enter retirement, maybe to provide intergenerational wealth. Those are people all the way on the right hand side. There's no right answer specifically, but you have to decide what makes the most sense for you. So, how much do you need to leave behind? Well, it all comes down to what goals you have and what you're trying to protect. For some people, their goal is that they want their funeral. Others say income, like, make sure I can take care of my parents if something were to happen to me. I want to pay off a mortgage. Maybe I want to pay for my kids' college, or maybe I want to leave an endowment to my university or my church. It could be anything that you'd want to leave behind, but it's important to know what that is. And sometimes people get really confused, right? They say, well, I read online I need to have 10 times my salary in life insurance. I say, well, for somebody that's 30 and somebody that's 50, the numbers are probably different, right? Because it's not factoring in your age. It's a very blunt way to look at it. So at Parco, we've developed a way more novel approach to it. And I think a great way to think about it is to look at somebody like Larry. So Larry's 51 years old, life insurance Larry. He's 51 years old. His spouse is 49 years old. He has two children who are 8 and 10. His annual salary is $100,000 a year, and he has a $300,000 mortgage. And his legacy goals, what he's decided is he'd like, if something were to happen to him, to be able to replace his income in retirement, or pardon me, to replace his income if he were to pass away, to have his mortgage paid off as well as his final expenses like his funeral, and he'd like to cover any educational expenses for his kids. So I think we'd say is, well, look, how much would it cost for Larry to replace that income? So he makes $100,000 a year, but net, so like after deductions, after taxes, everything like that, that's really 65,000 that he takes home. So when we determine that 65,000, that's like the amount that his spouse would need to have coming in. That's basically how much we have to basically figure out how much would an annuity cost for his spouse to replace that income, use assuming a cost of living. And so we go out into the market and look for that number to help us figure out this constant. And so for Larry, right off the bat, that's $1.8 million is the sort of protection that he would need right now to cover that um, for his spouse. So that's the first part of the estate that Larry would need to leave behind given that goal. Then he wants to have his mortgage and his funeral costs covered. Well, his mortgage, like we mentioned, is $300,000. And the average funeral right now, final expenses, is about $10,000. So those two together is $310,000. That's on top of the 1.8 that he needs. Then we need coverage for kids. And in Parker, we've developed this proprietary formula that basically looks at your kid's age and your salary to figure out how much coverage you would need to uh, cover for educational expenses and for other things for raising a kid. And so for each of his children, the 8-year-old and the 10-year-old, on top of the income replacement, we'd need an extra $260,000 coverage. So the total needed in his estate is over $2 million. Now, in Larry's case, and this label's not quite right. Now, in Larry's case, he has some assets, right? So we've determined how much his total estate need is. But what are the assets that he's got? Well, if he passes away, his spouse would get his $450,000 that he has in the TSP, $200,000 in savings, and then he has these FERS employee benefits that we're going to talk about as well. Well, the TSP, that's $450,000. His savings is another $200,000. So there's a $1.7 million coverage gap that we need to bridge either with life insurance or with his workplace benefits. And this is the type of planning that we help folks do. So let's talk about life insurance, right? Now that we have this kind of gap in mind for somebody like Larry. Well, what is life insurance? Life insurance is a contract between an insurer, so AIG, MetLife, North American, policy owner that guarantees that the insurer will pay a sum of money to named beneficiaries if the insured individual dies during the covered period. So it's a payment that you make during your life that if you pass away during the covered time pays out to your beneficiaries. It basically is meant to protect you from a premature death. It's extra money on top of your assets in your estate to leave behind your beneficiaries, right? To make sure that if the worst were to happen to you, you know financially that your family would have a benefit that would help them through that time. And there's lots of different types of life insurance. And some of you on the call tonight may have heard of some of these and maybe haven't. The simplest and least expensive type of life insurance is called term insurance. Then there's guaranteed universal life. Then there's index universal life or IUL. And then there's whole life on the far end, which is most expensive. Some of you may have been pitched or somebody recommended, or you see stuff on Facebook about, hey, you need to get into this IUL or this whole life to be your own banker and things like that. We're not going to talk about that tonight. We can talk about that in a future presentation. But generally, at Parco, we always recommend folks use life insurance for what it's best at, which is protection in case you pass away prematurely. So we try to keep things as inexpensive and as capital efficient as possible. So that way you don't have to have money tied up in premiums. And instead you can have that money invested or working for you in other ways. So when it comes to life insurance, there's kind of three main topics you need to know, or three main terms you need to know. There's premium, which is how much it costs you to have the coverage. There's your coverage, which is how much would pay out if you were to pass away. And there's your term, or how long you're covered. There's terms that last 1 year, there's terms that last 30 plus. If you have something like a guaranteed universal life or an IUL or a whole life, that'll be coverage basically for your entire life, for as long as you're alive. So that's some of the basics about life insurance. Now let's talk about FEGLI. So as federal employees, you guys actually get life insurance through work. The life insurance that you have offered through work is called FEGLI. And also, I always like to mention at this point in the presentation, if you do have any questions, you can ask them in the chat or the Q&A window. We'll answer them afterwards. So within FEGLI, Federal Employee Group Life Insurance, it's actually underwritten by MetLife. So MetLife is the private company that the government has contracted with to offer life insurance to federal employees and retirees. There's four main types of FEGLI. There's basic life, and then there's three optional FEGLIs: option A, option B, and option C. Now, FEGLI basic life is your salary rounded up to the nearest thousand plus $2,000. That's the coverage amount. Option A is a flat $10,000 in coverage. Option B is sometimes called the salary multiplier, and option C is family coverage. So let's go through each of these. Let's take again life insurance Larry. He has $100,000 salary. His basic life coverage would be $102,000. His option A coverage, if he has it, would be $10,000. Option B is multiples of your salary. You can have up to 5 multiples of your salary. So you could have between $100,000 and $500,000 of option B. And then option C is coverage not on you, the federal employee, but on your children and on your spouse. It's on your children under age 22. You can have between $2,500 and $25,000 coverage. So let's take a look at Larry again. So he is enrolled in the basic life through work. He also has option A, option B, and option C. And again, his goals were to replace his income, pay off his mortgage, and take care of his funeral and cover education expenses. Well, given the basic life that he has $102,000 in coverage, which costs him $35.36 per month right now. Option basic life is a good deal. So he would have this on top of his TSP as part of his pass away. Same thing with his option A. That's an extra $10,000 in coverage. It costs him $2.17 a month. That's that option A. You can see it's a pretty thin slice. Next is option B. So this is the big life insurance company that he has through FEGLI. It's $500,000 in coverage. He's paying over $108 per month for this. But extra layer of protection for him. And then he has option C. So this is coverage not on himself, but on his spouse and on his children. Now with option C, he has 5 multiples or 5 units. So he has $25,000 in coverage on his spouse. He has the max coverage on his spouse. And he has $12,500 in coverage on each of his children until they turn 22. He's paying $9 per month for this right now. This is outside of the stack of life insurances because it's coverage not on Larry, right? It's in coverage in case his wife passes away or his 2 kids pass away. So if we look at Larry right now, it's gotten bigger, right? He has those life insurances through work. He has his savings and he has his TSP, but he still has a decent size gap. Well, as a federal worker, you also have a few other benefits that some of you may not be aware of. It's called the basic employee death benefit, as well as a survivor benefit. So the basic employee death benefit is a benefit paid to you on top of your salary. On top of your FEGLI, on top of anything else, if you pass away while working for the federal government. The basic employee death benefit is calculated as your salary divided by 2, so 50% of your salary, plus a constant that they adjust each year. And for this year, it's $43,800 and change. So Larry's basic employee death benefit would be over almost $94,000 on top of anything else that he has. And this is paid out by OPM to the families of federal employees who pass away while they're employed. So that's another $94,000 in coverage. On top of that, if you pass away while working for the federal government, you're entitled to a survivor benefit. This means that your spouse is entitled to a portion of your pension, in this case, half your pension, if you pass away while working for the federal government. Also, your spouse gets to keep their federal health care if you pass away while working for the federal government. So in Larry's case, if he passed away right now, He has 20 years of service with the federal government. His pension would have been $9,200. 50% of that's $9,600 per year or $800 a month. That's on top of everything else. So when we're evaluating Larry's estate, we say, well, look, if his spouse got $800 paid to her per month, that's basically like an annuity. So what's the present value of an annuity like that when we're evaluating his estate? Well, that's worth almost $270,000. So when we start to stack up all the benefits and all the assets that Larry has, instead of having this really big gap, his gap we'd evaluate $690,000 of coverage. So now the question is, how should he think about bridging that gap? Well, with that $690,000 in coverage, he could look at getting some additional life insurance. And if he said, hey, look, I just need this coverage for the next 10 years, these are some term quotes that we pulled today for a 51-year-old man. If he had coverage for the next 10 years till he turned 61, that would cost him, we found quotes for a relatively healthy man about seven. If you wanted coverage out to 30 years, about $227 a month to fill that gap. And what's important to know, and this is why things are so dynamic, this gap changes over time, right? As you get older, your coverage need is always biggest when you're youngest, right? When your family's the youngest, when you have usually the least amount of savings, when you maybe have the most mortgage debt. So your coverage need, your estate need declines over time because your kids are getting older, right? So there's less need to cover them. You're getting older as well. So the years of missed income are lower. So getting back to that present value math we were doing, that shrinks the amount of coverage that you need. Also, usually folks, as they get older, they're paying down their mortgage. So if that's a goal for them, the cost of covering that mortgage goes down. And their investments values can grow, right? So as they get wealthier, they don't need to use as much life insurance to fill that gap because they already have that money other places. So it's one of the things that our platform's able to analyze for you, and it's why we recommend folks evaluate that regularly because you might have a gap today, but over time that might become a surplus. And when we're talking about surplus and long-term FEGLI planning, this is where folks, especially on today's call, might start saving some real money, right? Because many of you on the call tonight are probably closer to retirement than you are to starting your careers. And the FEGLI covers that you signed up for when you were younger maybe made a lot of sense. But maybe now it doesn't make as much sense because of the dynamics, how FEGLI works and how it starts to get expensive. So as you approach retirement and then as you enter retirement, you have different choices you get to make on your FEGLI. So with basic life, by far the most common election is to do what's called the 75% reduction option. What this means is that when you retire or turn 65, whatever happens second, your basic life will be free. So you'll no longer pay for it, but the coverage amount that you have will reduce by 2% per month until it gets down to 25% of its value. So in Larry's case, it would reduce down from $102,000 to $25,500 in coverage that he would have for life, which again, getting back to kind of some of that math, that would cover a lot of his final expenses or burial coverage, in fact, in surplus. So for a lot of federal workers that we talk to who say, hey, I saw this ad on TV, they're trying to recommend me this funeral coverage, or this guy came and knocked at my door and said, hey, I need to buy this funeral coverage. We say, well, look, you've got your basic life. I don't necessarily know if you need it. Have you evaluated that or have you considered that? Option A in retirement works very similar to how basic life works, in that at 65 or retirement, whichever happens second, it becomes free automatically, starts to reduce by 2% per month down to 25% of its value or $2,500. Then there's option B. So we're going to spend a minute talking about this. So option B starts to become prohibitively expensive as you get older. Remember, you can have up to 5 multiples of your salary of option B. So let's look at Larry's situation, right? He's 51 years old, he's in good health, he makes $100,000 a year. He has 5 multiples of option B. So what does this mean? Well, if he keeps this option B for the next 10 years till he turns 61, he'll pay over $22,000 in premiums. If he keeps it for the next 20 years, he'll pay over $93,000 in premium. If he keeps it for the next 30 years, he'll pay over almost $300,000 in premium. So it starts to get very expensive as you get older. And you can see this average premium. This is the annual amount with FEGLI. If he says, look, I need $500,000 in coverage, but I really only need it for the next 10 years until my kids get out of high school, or I need it for the next 20 years until maybe they're married and have kids. There are oftentimes way cheaper alternatives, especially if you are healthy outside of the government. And that's something we help folks strategize on every day here at Parka because that's money. Like let's take an example of the 20-year. If you went with somebody that we found for him over that 20-year period, he'd spend $12,000 in premiums versus 93,000 with FEGLI. So that's over $80,000 difference that could be invested. That could go to help pay for his kid's school or invest in the TSP. Uh, so it's really important to consider this, especially as you're getting older, and especially if life insurance is important to you, because oftentimes there's cheaper alternatives outside of the federal government. Now, that said, if you do have a health issue that makes it impossible for you to get underwriting or good pricing for life insurance outside of FEGLI, then FEGLI can be a great option for you because you're getting coverage no matter what, right? It's guaranteed acceptance. The healthiest person who works for the government and the least healthy person who works for the government pay the same price for FEGLI, depending on their age. I thought this graph was really useful. This shows the cumulative premiums that Brian would pay for the next 30 years. Red shows the cost of a 30-year term policy. Blue shows how much you would pay in FEGLI over that time period. So you can see how that cost really starts to balloon over time. Next is option C. C, like I mentioned, coverage not on you, the federal employee, but on your spouse and on your kids under age 22. Now, in an audience this large, oftentimes there will be people who are paying for option C coverage who do not have an insurable interest. What does that mean? It means first, you have to be enrolled in option C. If you are enrolled in option C and you are no longer married, or maybe you were never married, and your children are over age 22, so all three of those things have to be true, then you are owed a refund for your option C premium because there's nothing that could happen where you'd be able to collect a death benefit. So we've had clients who were, maybe they were never married and their kids are 30 and they're paying for option C. Well, if that's the case, you're actually owed a refund. We've helped folks get thousands of dollars back from filing an option C reimbursement letter. It takes about 8 weeks. But if you think that's you, let us know. It's one of the things our platform can also identify because you're owed that money back. Here's the thing too, like MetLife is never going to call you and say, hey, look, Larry, I heard Timmy just turned 22 years old. That's awesome. Congratulations. Hopes everything's going well. You can stop paying us for that life insurance, right? That's never going to happen. So you have to be proactive and monitor it. And that's one of the things that we help our clients focus on it with our platform every single day. An important tip that we always like to bring up here when it comes to life insurance is that it's important to be proactive, right? You have to be your own advocate. Make sure you update your beneficiaries. We've had folks who we're working with as they retire and they say, man, like I haven't updated my beneficiaries, and we find out their ex-spouse is still on their as the beneficiary on their life insurance. If you were to pass away, the life insurance goes whoever the named beneficiary is. So if it's your ex-spouse or your rival or somebody you don't like, make sure you update those. And also make sure your beneficiaries know that they're beneficiaries so they know there's a benefit to go collect. So when it comes to FEGLI, the biggest things to remember are basic life's a pretty good deal. Option A is kind of neutral. Option B can get expensive, so it's worth looking at private alternatives and evaluating the costs. And option C, you may or may not be owed a reimbursement. And one of the nice things about our platform is it helps evaluate your entire estate. And you can see all of your life insurances all in one easy to look at place. So we've gone through a whole lot. And when we think about the different life insurance and retirement checklists, first, determine how big of an estate you need. Then evaluate your net assets and life insurance and determine if there's a gap or a surplus there. Drop any unnecessary FEGLI coverage that you have. We've had folks, it's like, why are you paying for life insurance if you don't need it? That's just money going to MetLife. Evaluate private life insurance options if that's something that you want. Especially if you're enrolled in life insurance, it's worth looking at alternatives. It doesn't cost anything to do so. Check if you're owed a reimbursement for FEGLI option C, and then create your account on the Parco platform, which will be able to manage your specific life insurance situation and a whole lot. The things that we most help folks with here at Parco on our platform. That's why thousands of federal employees help them plan their retirements. So with that, I'm going to open up the for our questions. It was a pleasure to present to you all, and we're looking forward to helping questions that you have. Hopefully, you all enjoy the presentation tonight. We work really hard to make these decks really capable and clear. Any questions or any feedback on that as well?